Welcome to the InfoMullet YouTube channel. If you enjoy this content, please like or share. And if you'd like to support the InfoMullet by becoming a mulleteer, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate your support. I wanted to start out with an update on the pandemic responses and focus on the national responses. So back in March, we outlined 5 national responses that seemed to be emerging. It was the people's War, which was sort of the Chinese response, the pandemic panopticon, which was the Korean response, the hammer and the dance, which you saw of a lot of major countries. You had induced herd immunity, tested by a lot of countries, abandoned by all but Sweden. And you also had what we've come to call the thoughts and prayers approach of the United States. So what I wanted to do is start out with an update of where we are on those. So let me bring up here. And so in June, on 24th of June, we shared these 2 things, and this is a representative example of the pandemic responses of 4 of those different strategies. I selected 4 countries that are sort of endemic of this type of response. So just to clear the chart so everyone can understand how the chart's being written, on the left, the vertical axis, this is the daily new cases per 100,000. It's a 7-day moving average, so it's a lagged over the last 7 days. That gets a little bit of the jerkiness out and the noise of the data. And it's got on the bottom right are the days since the first confirmed case in that country. So all the countries are aligned to start at the same time, which means their lines at the end are going to end at different times because some countries have had the pandemic longer than others. And the 4 countries we're profiling are the ones I just mentioned. We have Germany, which is modeling the hammer and the dance. The hammer is where you go in a lockdown to build your testing capability, your contact tracing. You go into the dance, which is a partial reopen or even a full reopen, because you've got those capabilities in place, but you're ready to go back in the lockdown with the hammer. So the hammer and the dance is probably the strategy I've been recommending the most. The pandemic panopticon is what South Korea, Singapore, and some countries with prior SARS experience, mainly in South Asia and Southeast Asia, have been using. That is a very heavy technological effort with complete awareness of where infected individuals are. It runs into a little bit of civil liberties issues when that kind of, and privacy laws, when that technology comes over into Western Europe and the US, but it is a response that we're seeing. And then what we've called the thoughts and prayers approach with the US, which is sort of like, we'll go into lockdown, kind of, and then we'll get out of the lockdown, kind of, and just kind of hope things work out. So this was in June. I want to be clear, this is date current as of June 24th. And you can see here the 4 countries and the responses. Again, these are representative of lots of different countries trying this. We're not the only one doing thoughts and prayers. Germany's not the only one doing in hammer and dance, but it's representative. So, and the daily new cases, you can see that the hammer and the dance and the pandemic panopticon were good at causing that nice growth and decline of an initial outbreak and at lower levels than other responses. You can see here the induced herd immunity of Sweden. That's where they kept it relatively open, but trying to protect the elderly population. That didn't really work so well and had a spike. And then, of course, the US approach has struggled. So when we look here back in June, we were looking at the deaths per capita. So again, to clear the chart, these are the deaths per capita of 100,000. Now, this is cumulative over time, so you're not going to see these lines decrease because it's an accumulation of deaths over time per capita. But if we think about your overall goals of a national response is to manage the daily cases while minimizing the amount of harm and suffering. And we can use deaths as a proxy because, yes, there's hospitalizations, there's recovery times, there's all that, but obviously death is the most severe. And you can see pretty clearly here how at the time, Sweden and its induced herd immunity was doing the worst overall, had about 50 deaths per 100,000 people. The US was behind it, mid-30s. And then Germany much lower at 10, and the pandemic panopticon in South Korea almost 0. So that's where we were at the end of June. And people were giving me a hard time on YouTube that this was old. So I had some Swedish people yelling at me that it's gotten much better and you aren't reflecting that. So because I take my Swedish audience very seriously, I have updated the charts. Where we stand right now, as of August 4th, not good for the US, as you can see. So again, this is the chart with the 7-day moving average of new cases. And you can see here, again, Germany, has contained, they've had a few minor flare-ups. That's the dance doesn't mean you'll never have a flare-up again, but I do these per capita so you can see them normalized across the populations of these countries. You can see them in context. Even though Germany has had some flare-ups, they've never really hit a major issue. Same with South Korea. Now, Sweden, with its induced herd immunity, to the points of the Swedes, their daily new cases have dropped off significantly. And that's a good sign. We'll talk about why here in a second. But it's really dropped off in the last couple of weeks. Whereas the United States, we've talked about wave 1.5. I've been talking about it for a while. We knew it was coming. It came out and it had this huge upswing in cases, over to 20 new cases per 100,000. And just in the last couple of days has had this steep drop off. But I want to put this drop off in perspective, right? Because it looks like it's dropping down. This is, first of all, a lot of people are saying, well, this is because the White House is taking the data. It may be data manipulation. It may, but when you have a large outbreak, you have these peaks and declines. Look at Germany. It's got an up and it's got a down. And the reason why is the society begins reacting to this realization of the danger. And if you were, we were not unaware of the dangers. We got up to 60,000, almost 70,000 new cases a day. Then the deaths started raising, and we'll go over that in a second. So it's not unusual to see a steep drop-off, but I want to put this in context. This drop-off, that's only down to 45,000 new cases a day. That's still much worse than at any point throughout the outbreak than these other representative countries. Now, when it comes to deaths per capita, again, the updated chart, this is the response. And this is why it's important to look at these charts from a standpoint of national pandemic response. Germany has flatlined out. They still have a few deaths. It happens, but it's largely flat. South Korea is, I think, at a couple hundred. Germany's at maybe 5,000, but normalized for the population, they're at 10 deaths per 100,000. But look at what's going on here with Sweden and the US. This is why induced herd immunity is such a bad pandemic response to pick, in that even though they finally got the outbreak under control, it looks like the daily new cases, they have suffered so many casualties in Sweden that if their population adjusted numbers, we're still catching up to them. Even with all the deaths going on in the United States, when you normalize it across populations, we're still playing catch up. Now, it's possible that Sweden will flatten out here and we'll catch up and exceed it because we continue to have a problem that we're not able to control. But I wanted to put in context of Sweden in its neighborhood. So Sweden exists in the Baltic neighborhood. It's got Finland, Norway on one side, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania on the other. Across the sea, it's got Germany, Denmark's around there. And these other countries are important to understand the regional context of why is Sweden now able to control its outbreak where it wasn't before, and how is it doing relative to them? So this chart I've shown before, but it's been updated, and to clear it, on the left, again, deaths per 100,000 in a simple column now because it's a category. It's not over time, it's a category. But I've also superimposed the population density per country, because people are sometimes saying, well, Sweden has a higher population density than Norway, and that's why it's not doing as well. So, okay, on the right side is the population density per square kilometer. And what it just shows really clearly is Sweden's death per 100,000 is up here about 55, and it's way higher than all its neighbors: Denmark, Germany, Finland, Norway, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. And sure, some of these countries have a lower population density than Sweden, but Denmark and Germany have a much higher population density. Even Lithuania, which is a dense city area, has a higher, and they're doing much better. So part of Sweden's benefit is that the neighborhood it's in is managing this much better than Sweden has. So there's no reservoir to reinfect Sweden from its neighboring countries. There's no ability for the infection outbreak to continue breaking out. Like, imagine if Georgia were taken, we took all the states and we took Georgia out and we surrounded it with Massachusetts, Washington, Arkansas, Montana, Hawaii. We kind of surrounded Georgia with states that are doing really, really well. If Georgia ever beat the outbreak, there'd be no reinfection reservoirs from which to bring it to. But the problem in the US is we have a lot of reinfection reservoirs regionally that as one area beats the outbreak, it can be reinfected from another area. And that's the real challenge of wave 1.5, which brings me to where we're at on the death rate, just to show you the average death rate in the US. The US is now doing objectively worse. If we were to take Sweden today and compare it to the US is doing objectively worse on just about any measure. But I've been tracking this chart for a while. Again, to clear it, daily deaths, now we're in an absolute number per day. And it's the columns, the blue columns are the deaths per day, and the red is a 7-day moving average. And you can see this sort of weekend pattern where it goes down over the weekend and spikes up. And we've got the two major revisions highlighted where a state had a backlog and dumped a bunch of deaths on that day from the backlog, but we're not entirely sure where they were allocated. So I've just called those out, but you can see the overall pattern here forming of the wave 1.5, or what I've called the double hump. You have that first rise and peak in the New Jersey, New York supercluster. You have that long, slow, painful decline over May, while we're still over 1,000 deaths on average on the 7-day average. And then we drop here in May, and this is when, or in, excuse me, June, this is when we start reopening a little bit in May, even as late as April. Some states were reopening, but pretty much by mid-May, all the states are reopened. We think we're doing well. People are trying to warn it, but everyone's ignoring it. And now we've had that return increase back up to where the last week to week and a half, we've had, 900, 1,000 deaths a day during the week. And then those drop to a couple hundred over the weekend. And that's right now where we're at, unfortunately, on the, sort of where we're at. So when we look at national pandemic responses, I think we can still say those countries that are doing the hammer and the dance are doing much, much better. And that's one reason I put these in population adjusted sizes. I see Ms. Falkenberry here is asking about, is Korea because of a smaller population? By doing it per capita, we normalize those differences. So we were looking in those earlier charts per 100,000. And Rory's asking about Australia, the increase of cases in Australia, and Rory's asking about, what's the name? I want to say it's Wales. There's a province in Australia that's been locked down, and a specific city, and they're basically doing the hammer and the dance, and that area has gone from the dance back to the hammer. If you look at the cases per capita, it would be much lower than the US, but they're still going back into the lockdown in those areas, which is what you want to see, because you don't want the cases to get as high as they are in the US, because that's what breaks the curve and you fail to flatten the curve and the death rate spikes. So that, yeah, Australia is struggling right now in a specific province, and especially in a specific city, and it's one of the more populous ones. But I think if you were to compare, Rory, the population per capita, you would find that Australia has introduced the lockdowns at a much lower level than what we are in the US, because right now in the US, we're not even, considering lockdowns. Although fortunately, the school reopening that I talked about a few weeks ago, our last episode on school reopenings, I predicted people would not want to reopen schools. And we've seen some bad results of camps and schools being reopened, and now a serious consideration of keeping them closed. But Joe Hogan asked, before the AMA, and I want to get this before we go into the domestic and other affairs, last bit on COVID. He asked, what does this mean in terms of travel? What does this mean for where can we travel? Where will we be able to travel? What kinds of travel will be open? And so I brought back up the, this is from the Austrian Complexity Institute, this link. All the links for this stuff are in the notes of this, and they'll be, if you're watching on YouTube, they're in the comments below the YouTube. So this is a worldwide map done by the Complexity Science Hub in Vienna, Austria, and it's got a simple green, yellow, red, and what they're doing is taking the positive cases per 10,000 inhabitants within last 14 days. Green is under 1 positive case, yellow is under 10, and red is over 10. So you can see here what I'm talking about. When we talk about, here's Sweden, by the way. It's really decreased, or excuse me, that's Finland. Sweden's here in the middle. 3 positive cases per 10,000. That's a nice decrease, but it's surrounded by green or lower countries that are doing better, which is one reason I think it's able to contain this. Anywhere there's green on this map, you're going to see regional trade blocks I've described before begin to offer limited tourism between the green countries, maybe some of the yellow countries as well, as they keep it under control. Anywhere that's red, I wouldn't anticipate travel, at least legal travel. I would anticipate bans on tourism, bans on business travel, disruption of supply and trade. I mean, obviously containers are different than people, so you're going to still see some of that. But where the reds are on this map, you're going to continue to see very serious travel restrictions that have risen up as this second wave outbreaks. And Rory, to your question, although it doesn't break down Australia overall or into the individual provinces, you're talking 2.5 cases per 10,000 overall. And in the US, we can just pick a state here, like South Carolina, 41 cases per 10,000, Georgia, 47, Florida, 61, Arizona, 47. So, I mean, it's yes, Australia has had a new surge and it's controlling it, but it's doing it, that dance, at a much lower level, which is, you know, what you want to see people to do it. Thanks, Guy mentioned it was Victoria province in Melbourne. Thanks for that. So that's the COVID update. I think we're all familiar with wave 1.5. Thanks for watching the video. Hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to follow the InfoMullet, visit us on Facebook or Twitter. And if you'd like notifications when we post new video content, click on the red subscribe button below the video. If you've ever wanted to become a mulleteer and support the InfoMullet, visit us on Patreon. We appreciate the support.